The papers shook in my hands as if they carried a storm inside them. After nearly 3 decades on the bench, I thought I had seen every kind of betrayal. But nothing prepared me for this, a legal petition declaring me senile, unsafe, and unfit to manage my own life. I was 64 years old, retired from my post as one of the most respected judges in our county, and now accused of being a confused old woman in need of guardianship. Worse, the petition had been filed by my daughter-in-law, Fallon, and my only son, Marcus, had signed his name in support. The words on the page struck like physical blows. Severe cognitive decline. Unable to manage daily activities safely. Allegations twisted out of the ordinary moments of forgetfulness that plague anyone. I had once arrived late to lunch with a neighbor because I lost track of time while reviewing case files. Fallon called it confusion about time and place. I had once left a soup pot simmering while I carried a package next door. Fallon described it as dangerous negligence. Even my decision to guard my own financial records was painted as paranoia. It wasn't incompetence Fallon was after, it was control. The realization dawned slowly, and then all at once. Fallon had been watching me. Every detail of my life, every moment of distraction was being collected like evidence in a trial. And Marcus, my son, the boy I had raised alone after his father died, had believed her. That was the cut that bled deepest. When the phone rang, I almost didn't answer. But years on the bench had trained me never to shy from confrontation. Mom, Marcus said, his voice taut. "Did you get the papers?" I forced my tone steady. "I did." I waited for an explanation for him to tell me it was all a mistake, but instead he hesitated. "Fallon thinks it's for the best. She's worried about you living alone. And honestly, so am I." The words hollowed me out. Worried about what exactly, I asked. He mumbled about confusion, about appliances left on. But when pressed, every incident he cited came not from his own eyes, but from Fallon's whispers. She had turned my son into her echo, and in his mind, betrayal wore the mask of love. That night, I sat alone in my study, surrounded by law books that had once been my tools for protecting the innocent. I began writing notes the way I always had before a complex case. Only this time, I was the case. The hearing was set for the following Friday. If the judge granted emergency guardianship, I could lose my finances, my medical decisions, even my home. The days that followed made it clear Fallon's campaign was far from over. At the grocery store, her friend Jennifer filmed me as I compared oatmeal boxes' ordinary shopping stage to look like confusion. My neighbor called after Fallon told her to keep an eye on me. Then Marcus and Fallon arrived at my home unannounced, playing the part of caring relatives while trading loaded glances. Each encounter was another brick in the prison Fallon was constructing around me. The worst was the fire department showing up at my door after an anonymous tip claimed I might be in danger from a kitchen fire. My oven had smoked from a bit of spilled marinade, nothing more. But the scene witnessed by neighbors would surely be retold as proof of incompetence. I knew Fallon's hand was in it. She was tightening the net, preparing the gallery of witnesses who would stand in court to call me incapable. I reached out to Patricia Williams, a retired colleague who knew me as well as anyone. "This is elder abuse, Loretta," she said without hesitation. "Classic financial and emotional manipulation. You must fight back." Her certainty was a lifeline. Fallon had underestimated one thing: I was not an easy woman to erase. When the day of the hearing arrived, the courthouse felt strange beneath my feet. I had walked these halls for years in robes of authority, but now I was simply the defendant carrying a thin folder of my own defense. The courtroom was crowded, neighbors, acquaintances, people Fallon had whispered to. She had filled the gallery with eyes primed to pity me. At the petitioner's table sat Fallon, composed, and polished in her gray suit, with Marcus beside her, looking strained. Fallon's lawyer, a seasoned predator of elder law, opened with honeyed words about decline and protection. A doctor who had never examined me testified as though my supposed dementia were medical fact. Then came neighbors and acquaintances, each echoing the same story of confusion and risk, all drawn from Fallon's script. I listened as the picture was painted a fragile woman slipping into incompetence. But the blow that nearly broke me came when Marcus took the stand. My son, voice trembling, repeated Fallon's lies as though they were his own. Confused dates, strange financial decisions, safety concerns. Tears ran down his face as he said, "I don't think she can manage alone anymore, and it kills me to admit that." In that moment, I saw how deeply Fallon had poisoned him. He believed betrayal was love. Yet when my turn came, I rose on unsteady legs with every ounce of steel I had left. This was no longer about dignity alone. It was about survival. I began with the simplest blade I owned, questions sharpened by decades of trial work. The petitioner's expert, Dr. Robert Chen, had just diagnosed me by proxy. I stood and asked whether he had ever examined me in person. He had not. Whether he had requested or reviewed a single page of my medical records. He had not. Whether he agreed that dementia could not be declared from anecdotes, but required cognitive testing, imaging, and blood work. He agreed in principle, then tried to retreat into abstractions about consistent family reports. I pressed him into facts. He had no scores, no scans, no labs, no observation. Only hearsay. The courtroom air shifted a degree. The first seam in Fallon's costume visibly pulled. The parade of witnesses resumed, and I let it wash over me until it was my turn again. A neighbor cited the grocery store, describing me wandering between oatmeal boxes. I rose and asked where she had stood, how long she had watched, whether she had heard me compare prices, whether she had noticed me place one brand in my cart and proceed to checkout without incident. Her answers thinned to yes then no, then I don't recall. The fire captain testified next. He described arriving after an anonymous tip, finding windows open and a faint odor of smoke. Under my questions, he conceded there was no fire, no damaged property, no hazard, and no elderly resident in distress. The gallery, which Fallon had stacked with sympathetic faces, leaned forward as if realizing that sympathy could be misdirected. Then they called Marcus. My son's step onto the stand sounded in my body like a dropped glass. He spoke gently, haltingly about dates I had supposedly mixed up, doors I had allegedly left unlocked, heirlooms I had given away. When I cross-examined, I kept my voice so soft that only the microphone carried it. Which heirlooms? He could not name them. What day had I mistaken? He was uncertain. Who told him about the unlocked door? He said Fallon had, and he had not checked it himself. It took 3 questions for the truth to show his testimony was a mirror of hers, polished and repeated until it gleamed like sincerity. When he looked at me, shame gathered in his eyes, but the shame was not yet for lying. It was for not knowing. Fallon saved herself for last. In a cool gray suit and the theatrical restraint she mistook for credibility, she mourned my supposed decline. She described finding me fully dressed at 2 a.m., insisting it was time for work. She told of water running until a bathroom flooded. She recalled a house full of smoke and my confusion with the alarm. I had never done any of those things. Her voice broke with practiced timing, a tissue pressed to a dry cheek, the word love placed with care in every paragraph. Love in her version was a scabbard hiding a blade. When the petitioner rested, I stood with the folder I had assembled at midnight. I had chosen not to hire counsel, a calculation I knew might be misread as pride, yet it also allowed me to present myself as I was. I called my physician, Dr. Margaret Foster, who stated that 2 weeks earlier, I had passed memory and mental status checks, and that I remained independent, organized, and medically stable. The petitioner's lawyer tried to suggest that patients perform for their doctors, hiding what families see at home. Dr. Foster did not overreach. She said only what she knew, but what she knew was clear. There was no clinical evidence of cognitive decline. I called Dorothy Patterson my neighbor. Under direct examination, she admitted that before Fallon's visit, she had not noticed any troubling behavior. Afterward, she had been told to keep an eye on me. She conceded that the incident she earlier described about my supposed confusion over a day had been relayed by Fallon and was not her own observation. The second seam pulled. Finally, I took the stand. I gave the court an inventory of my life, not as a defense, but as a portrait. I lived alone by choice. I kept my calendar with the same tidy pen I had used for years. I drove safely, cooked carefully balanced accounts to the penny, and volunteered twice weekly at the legal aid clinic. I did not deny that I had once lost track of time while reading, or that a splash of marinade had smoked in my oven, or that I checked my calendar before agreeing to plans. I denied only the alchemy that turned errands into incompetence and caution into paranoia. When the petitioner's lawyer asked if everyone else was just lying, I said I believed many people had been primed to see decline. When you hand someone a red lens, I told him they stopped noticing the blue. I turned then to what I had built in the days after the petition, the only way I knew how to breathe underwater a timeline. I had logged dates, times, conversations, visits, and phone calls. I had listed the afternoon when Jennifer filmed my cart in the cereal aisle, the morning when an anonymous tip brought fire trucks, the evening when Marcus and Fallon arrived unannounced and commented on the heat as if I could not feel it. The judge admitted the timeline into evidence. The gallery stilled. For the first time, the mask flickered on Fallon's face. I recognized it from 1,000 witnesses, the quick calculation of risk. Her lawyer stood to object, insisting that meticulous note-taking proved nothing about my capacity. I let him finish. Then I did what I had saved for last. I said that the court had heard a story about decline. What it had not yet heard was context. The context was a pattern best explained not by medicine, but by motive. The clock over the rear doors read 11 a.m. when the judge leaned forward with a question that would rearrange the room. He asked how I had learned to conduct such a precise self-representation, to question experts, to weigh hearsay, to build a record that could survive appeal. His tone was neutral, but I saw curiosity in the set of his mouth, and I knew the moment had come to stop obscuring what I had once been. I looked up at the bench I had stood beneath for half my career and answered him plainly. I know how to do this. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady, but weighted with years. Because for 28 years, I sat where you sit now. I am Judge Loretta Hayes, retired from this very courthouse. The silence that followed had substance like fog, thick enough to touch. A murmur rippled across the gallery as faces turned surprise, reshaping pity into recognition. Even Judge Morrison, careful in his composure, betrayed a flicker of shock before masking it again. Fallon's face drained of color. For weeks she had sold a story of a confused old woman, but that story cracked beneath the fact that the woman in question had once presided over hundreds of cases, including guardianships just like this one. Morrison called a recess. The gavel struck, and I exhaled for the first time since dawn. In the hallway, clerks I had mentored over the years approached me with whispered encouragement. Judge Hayes, we had no idea, one said. Marcus stood across the corridor staring at me as though he were trying to reconcile two different mothers, the one Fallon described, and the one who had just dismantled an expert witness with surgical precision. Fallon herself was around the corner, speaking rapidly into her phone, her posture brittle. She had not expected her opponent to be a judge. When we reconvened, Morrison noted for the record, My service and judicial history. This omission troubles the court, he said, looking squarely at Fallon's attorney. The tide had turned, and Fallon knew it. I could feel her desperation rising. That was when I introduced the evidence I had held in reserve. The first set of documents was a financial report I had compiled, every deposit, expenditure, and donation carefully cataloged. This shows that my financial management has been exemplary, I said, pointing out a decade-long pattern of stability. Next, I submitted letters from organizations I served with after retirement: the Bar Association, Legal Aid, the Scholarship Committee. Each letter spoke of my reliability and sharpness. Finally, I reached for what I called my nuclear option: the recordings. I had installed a home security system weeks earlier, my instincts buzzing with suspicion. On the audio, Fallon's voice filled the courtroom speakers, crisp and undeniable. "The old bat is tougher than I thought," she told someone on the porch. "But it doesn't matter. Marcus is convinced, and once we get guardianship, we can sell the house and move her somewhere she can't interfere." Gasps erupted in the gallery. Marcus froze as if lightning had passed through him. There was more. A second recording captured Fallon coaching Jennifer about what to say regarding the grocery store. "Make it sound like she was lost," Fallon instructed. Jennifer hesitated, but Fallon pressed, invoking Marcus's inheritance. The third was worse still, Fallon urging someone to call the fire department with a false report of a kitchen blaze. "It's not fraud if you're genuinely concerned," she argued, her tone coaxing, manipulative, ruthless. The courtroom dissolved into chaos. People shouted. Marcus buried his face in his hands. Fallon sat white and trembling. The gavel hammered for order, but the atmosphere had shifted permanently. This was no longer about concern for my welfare. It was about fraud, witness tampering, and the manipulation of a family for money. Morrison's expression hardened. "Mr. Butler," he said to Fallon's lawyer, "does your client wish to withdraw this petition?" Butler hesitated, conferring in frantic whispers with Fallon, who shook her head violently. Instead, she made her fatal mistake. She stood and pointed at me, voice rising into a shriek. "She faked those recordings. This is her paranoia on full display. She's trying to frame me." The gallery inhaled as one. Accusing a retired judge of fabricating evidence in her own defense was a gamble only a desperate woman would make. Fallon's unraveling was complete when she cried, "She's going to die soon anyway. What about my kid's inheritance?" The gavel struck again. "Mrs. Hayes," Judge Morrison said, his tone cold, "you are held in contempt of court. Bailiff, take her into custody pending criminal charges for perjury, false reports, and witness tampering." Fallon shrieked as the bailiff cuffed her hands, her protest devolving into incoherence as she was led from the room. Marcus rose, slowly, tears streaming. "Mom," he whispered as I passed him, "I'm so sorry. I don't know how I couldn't see it." The words were raw, but I had no answer for him yet. My wounds were too fresh. The petition was dismissed with prejudice, never to be refiled. As I walked out into the sunlight, I felt the weight of freedom again. Freedom I had defended, not from strangers, but from the very people who should have stood by me. Fallon had underestimated me. She had forgotten that age does not erase strength, and experience sharpens rather than dulls resolve. But victory was only the beginning. The deeper wound remained my son's betrayal, and healing that would take more than a gavel strike. 6 months passed before the rhythms of life steadied again. I spent them tending my roses, reading thick novels, and relearning the peace of solitude. Yet, even in the quiet echoes of that courtroom lingered. Fallon had traded her gray suits for prison uniforms after pleading guilty to perjury, fraud, and witness tampering. I didn't attend the sentencing. I told Marcus I had already given enough of my time and spirit to her chaos. The prosecutor allowed me to submit a victim statement, but my words were not meant for Fallon. They were meant for others who might someday recognize the shape of manipulation, disguised as love. Marcus came every Sunday. The first visits were stiff, his shame still raw, his eyes avoiding mine. Slowly, conversations lengthened. We spoke of the children, of work, of simple things like recipes or the weather. The divorce had been finalized, and he carried the weary lines of a man who had seen his illusions shatter. But there was also sincerity in his effort to rebuild. He would bring photographs of Emma and Tyler, my grandchildren, and tell me cautiously that they asked about me. Fallon had spent years poisoning their perception of me, hiding gifts, twisting my absence into neglect. Undoing that would take time, but children are resilient, and I meant to be patient. One Sunday, Marcus sat across from me in the garden, hands folded tightly. "Do you forgive me?" he asked, voice breaking. "For what I said on the stand? For believing her over you?" The question pierced more deeply than I wanted to admit. Forgiveness wasn't neat. I took his hand and told him the truth. "You were manipulated just as I was attacked. You weren't my enemy, Marcus. You were her victim too." Tears slid down his cheeks, and I felt both the ache of old wounds and the faint stirrings of repair. Our family therapist once told us that toxic people force those around them to choose sides. Healthy families don't demand such loyalty tests. Fallon had thrived by making Marcus believe he had to prove love for her by doubting me. She had won by turning everyday disagreements into battles. Recognizing that pattern was his first step toward freedom. I could see in his eyes that he was learning to trust himself again, to question the way she had trained him to view the world. He confessed one afternoon, "She made me doubt my own memories of you." I started wondering if the mother I knew had ever really existed. That I told him gently is what skilled manipulators do. They don't just lie to others. They make you lie to yourself. He squeezed my hand like a man holding on to something solid after nearly drowning. Time worked its quiet medicine. Marcus began to see Fallon not as a wife who loved poorly, but as a woman who never truly loved at all, at least not in the way family deserved. "Do you think she ever cared for us?" he asked once. I considered carefully. I think she loved the idea of the life she built, the status, the house, the image of the perfect family. But real love requires seeing people as human, not as tools. His silence afterward told me he understood. One evening, as the sun sank orange over the garden, Marcus promised, "I won't let anyone treat you that way again. Not a partner, not a friend, not anyone. I know what manipulation looks like now." I smiled at his earnestness, though I knew recovery is not so simple. The real lesson I wanted him to keep was this: always trust your own instincts. When someone tries to convince you that your clear perceptions are false, you are staring at a red flag. I had written my victim impact statement late one night at the kitchen table. I didn't write it for Fallon. I wrote it for others, for children, watching parents be erased by concern, for elders accused of decline when they were only aging normally, for families straining under lies. The most insidious abuse, I wrote, is the kind that pretends to be love. I sealed the letter, then set it aside. Whether or not I ever mailed it no longer mattered. I had already said what I needed to say. The greatest victory was not Fallon's conviction, nor even the dismissal of the petition. It was the return of my life to my own hands. I still lived in the home I chose among the roses I tended, guided by the calendar I kept. I was not perfect nor free from the slips of age, but I was myself intact, and no one would ever steal that from me again. To those listening now, perhaps you see shadows of your own life in mine. Beware of love that disguises control. Beware of concern that isolates instead of supports. And above all, guard the truth of who you are, because once you surrender, that the fight to reclaim it is brutal. If this story moved you, I invite you to like, share, and subscribe so more people can hear it. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, I'd love to know how far these lessons reach. And never forget your independence, your dignity, your voice, they are worth protecting.